Timothy Davidson Jr. grew up to be a beloved yet highly overprotected individual. When he was just 18 months old, his mother tragically died in a car accident, and since then he was raised solely by his father. Their home was filled with photographs of his mother, and everyone spoke of her with the utmost fondness. They described her as sweet, outgoing, and affectionate, someone who could make friends everywhere she went. But as Timothy grew older, his curiosity about his mother deepened, especially about her death. He would ask, but people were reluctant to share details, and no one would speak much about it, especially when it came to the circumstances of her passing. Few details were ever shared with him about whether she had been drinking, or if the other driver had been involved. No one would tell him anything at all. Simply that she died instantly, and that was the end of it. Over time, Timothy came to accept that this was a taboo subject in his family, so he stopped pushing for answers. As the years passed and adolescence arrived, he turned 14, and by then, he no longer asked about it. Timothy had always been very curious, especially around Christmas. For weeks, he would ask his father what he was going to give him, but his father wouldn't give him a hint. He kept insisting, hoping for some clue, but his father remained tight-lipped. Then one day, taking advantage of the fact that he was home alone, Timothy ventured into his father's room. He rummaged under the bed, through the dresser, and in the closet. As he sifted through several boxes, he found a letter that would change everything forever. It was a letter his father had written, intended to be sent to a popular program at the time, the Montel Williams Show. At first, Timothy thought it would be a silly, unimportant message, something his father would send simply because he was a big fan of the show. But as soon as he began reading, he realized it was nothing of the sort. The letter was related to the death of his mother, revealing that it hadn't been an accident. His father had been secretly trying for years to seek justice, writing to everyone from the local police to the FBI and even various television programs, pleading for the world to listen and not forget his wife's case. And it was in this moment that the intrigue of today's case truly began. Tonya Marie Eich McKinley was born on January 25, 2009. Tonya Marie Eich McKinley was born on January 21, 1961, in Milton, Florida. She was known for being exceptionally outgoing, making friends wherever she went, and having a deep love for music, particularly for the band Kiss. According to Renee, her older sister, their childhood was fantastic, always surrounded by loving people and filled with all sorts of activities. They went to the movies, loved skating, and enjoyed bowling every week. One characteristic that stood out about Tonya was her fearlessness. She believed that everyone was kind, and her open and trusting nature made her the center of attention wherever she went. Tonya's presence was captivating. Her laughter, her jokes, and the way she spoke drew everyone to her. She had an infectious charm and a star-like quality that made it impossible not to notice her. Tonya was the kind of person who always had an idea, and when she set her mind to something, she went for it, whether the idea was brilliant or a little crazy. One of these bold ideas came during her adolescence, just as she was finishing high school. She stood before her parents and announced that she and her best friend, Benita, who was also her cousin, were going to move to Pensacola together. Her parents, understandably, thought the idea was reckless, considering their youth and inexperience. But the girls were determined, and they had a plan. Tonya had it all figured out. She would become a medical transcriptionist, and Pensacola had a course for that. She assured her parents that if things didn't work out, she could always come back home. After convincing them, she and Benita left for Pensacola. Miraculously, everything went according to plan. Not only did they excel in their studies, but Tonya also met her first boyfriend, Timothy Davidson. Witnesses describe them as an ideal match, with shared tastes, hobbies, and personalities. But while they were drawn to each other from the start, their intense personalities often clashed. One moment they were deeply in love, and the next they were at odds, hating each other with equal passion. Their relationship was a roller coaster of emotions, breaking up and then getting back together repeatedly, creating a never-ending cycle of chaos. In 1981, amidst this turmoil, Tonia was arrested for a drug crime. Some sources suggest it was for drug possession, while others claim it was for drug distribution. Regardless, it seems more likely that it was possession. Why? After being arrested, booked, and fingerprinted, a detail that would prove crucial later, she was released, and once again she returned to Timothy. Their turbulent relationship continued, full of highs and lows. They would experience moments of happiness, only for their fights to resume, filled with hatred and anger. Yet, as time passed, they would always find their way back to each other. In 1982, Tonia discovered she was pregnant, an event that profoundly changed her outlook on life. Becoming a mother was the greatest joy she had ever known, and it made her realize that she didn't want her son to grow up surrounded by the constant fighting, screaming, and chaos. She longed for peace, tranquility, and happiness for her child. In 1983, when she gave birth to Timothy Davidson Jr., Tonia knew that she had to change her life. She tried to make their relationship work, striving to create a stable and peaceful environment for her son. However, the ongoing arguments and turmoil persisted, making it impossible to escape the chaos. By the time her son turned 17 months old, Tonia made the decision to separate. Initially, Timothy couldn't believe it. He thought they would reconcile within days. He tried to talk to her friends, to convince her to come back, but nothing worked. Tonia was resolute. She knew that she wanted a better life for her son, and she was determined to fight for it, no matter the cost. So, Tonia packed her bags and moved to the house of her best friend, Beta, who was married and had children. Together, they found comfort and peace, functioning as a good team. On the surface, everything seemed great in their lives. They appeared happy. But secretly, Tonia was devastated. To him. At the end of 1984, Tonia was 23 years old and a single mother to an 18-month-old child. She was starting over, living with her best friend, but the situation was incredibly difficult for her. She longed for the best for her son, hoping he would be happy, yet she herself felt lonely and lost. She believed that if she could be happy, her son would be too, but at that moment, she couldn't see a way out of the darkness. Everything seemed overwhelming. In an attempt to bring some joy into their lives, Benita suggested an idea. Her husband was planning a trip with friends at the end of the year, so she proposed that she and Tonia go out to have some fun while he was away. They would hire a babysitter to watch the children, and the two women would go to a bar, have drinks, and dance. They planned to return home by midnight to relieve the sitter, but not stay out all night. Just enough to unwind for a few hours. It was only when sunrise, unfortunately, that she was finally able to reveal what was in her mind. Despite the plan, Tonia had her baby with her the entire time, always focused on him and not thinking about herself or anything else. Hello, Minnie. Going out for a while seemed like the perfect plan for Tonia, and after Benita discussed it with her, Tonia agreed. So, on December 31, 1984, they dressed up and went to a bar called the Dars Bar and Grill. According to witnesses, as soon as they walked through the door, everyone turned to look at them, as it seemed that 90% of the people in the bar knew Tonia. She was outgoing, charismatic, and a friend to everyone, which made her the center of attention. That night, according to Benita, Tonya shone like never before. She danced, had a great time, and enjoyed a couple of drinks. She made new friends, and the outing was exactly what she needed. As the clock struck midnight, everyone toasted, and they continued dancing. After 10 or 20 minutes, Benita decided it was time to go home. But Tonya, feeling so happy, decided to stay for a bit longer. She told Benita that she would get a ride home from someone, as most of the bar was filled with her friends, so she wouldn't have trouble finding a ride. Benita, reassured, left for home, unaware that the next morning her best friend wouldn't be back yet. As Benita searched her room and the house, growing concerned, someone knocked at her door. It was her mother-in-law, who seemed very upset. She asked Benita if she knew if the police had called. Benita, confused, had no idea what her mother-in-law was talking about. The woman, still visibly distressed, struggled to find the words to explain what was happening. Finally, after a deep breath, she blurted out the devastating news. Just a couple of hours earlier, Benita received the shocking news that her best friend, Tonya, had been found dead, and the police were investigating the case. In the early hours of January 1, 1985, a family living in a house on Peacock Drive in Pensacola had a problem with their dog. The animal was very ill, and the situation was so dire that they decided to rush it to the emergency room. All the family members, including the young daughter, got into the car. As they opened the garage door and drove out to the street, the little girl turned around and asked her mother what a mannequin was. These words shocked everyone, and when the adults turned around to look, they realized it was not a mannequin at all, but a lifeless body. When the police arrived, they could not believe what they were seeing. The street, a residential area with several houses, had no witnesses. The woman's body was lying on the ground, discarded like garbage, and a bloody towel was nearby. The scene was grotesque. There were clear signs of a struggle, including scratches, bruises, strangulation marks, and a heavy blow to the head. Her dress was askew, her heels scattered on the ground, and the bloody towel was covered with both dog hairs and human traces. At first, they didn't know who the victim was, but upon taking her fingerprints, they quickly identified her as Tonya McKinley. The police immediately contacted her family to inform them of the tragic discovery, and the investigation began. It was soon revealed that Tonya had been brutally assaulted before her death. The attack had been violent, there was a struggle, a heavy blow to her head, and finally she had been strangled. After ending her life, the attacker discarded her body on the road, as if nothing had happened. The crime scene was not where the body was found. The assailant had killed Tonya elsewhere and then discarded her body on that street. Fortunately for the police, DNA evidence was left on both the body and the towel. However, at that time, DNA research was still in its infancy, so they could not proceed with it as a primary lead. The only thing they could ascertain was that the assailant's blood type was A, based on samples taken from the body and towel. The police then turned their attention to the bar where Tonya was last seen. Everyone there knew her. Some people reported seeing her leave either alone or possibly escorted, but oddly, no one seemed to have seen anything after 1:30 a.m. Tonya's trail faded after that, and the investigation stalled. Naturally, the prime suspect was her ex-boyfriend, Timothy, the father of her son. He had been harassing her, calling constantly, and attempting to reconcile with her. However, on the night of the crime, he had an alibi, and his blood type didn't match that of the assailant, so he was ruled out. The police returned to the bar to question witnesses again, and it soon emerged that the bar's manager, a man named Kurt, might have had something to do with Tonya McKinley's death. According to witnesses, Kurt and Tonya had been spending a lot of time together in the weeks leading up to the incident. They were seen flirting, going on dates, and becoming increasingly close. This new lead began to raise suspicions. This shift in focus made Kurt a suspect, but his alibi and blood type didn't match, so he was ruled out. Over time, the case lost momentum, and without new evidence or sufficient resources, it began to grow cold. For years, the police were unable to make progress due to the lack of advanced investigative tools. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when new DNA analysis techniques were developed, that the case was revisited. DNA samples collected from the crime scene, those of the victim, a male, and an animal, specifically a dog, were sent to a laboratory. The male's DNA was uploaded to the CODIS database, but unfortunately there were no matches. The assailant had no prior record, which made identifying him incredibly challenging. Investigators were left hoping for a mistake on his part, but that mistake never came. In 2015, 15 years after the crime, a new investigator took over the case. This investigator had a brilliant idea. If the assailant didn't have a criminal record, maybe a relative of his did. This approach would prove to be the breakthrough the investigation had been waiting for. The investigation took a turn when the team searched CODIS for DNA matches that could suggest familiar connections. They eventually found a potential lead, someone who wasn't a direct relative but might have a distant connection to the assailant. They contacted this individual and their family, requesting DNA samples from all of them. However, it turned out there was no match, and the family wasn't actually related to the suspects. This setback was another blow to the investigation, leaving them to feel as though they had wasted precious time. The case had slowly become known as the Pensacola Nightmare. Occasionally, small articles were published, but the truth was there were no solid leads. Unlike other cases where witnesses existed and at least a sketch could be made, this one lacked even that. No one could explain how a well-known, outgoing woman could disappear from a bar without leaving a trace, how no one saw her leave or heard anything certain she hadn't told them. It seemed almost impossible. This baffling mystery caught the attention of a reporter named Tony Adame, who had always been fascinated by true crime stories, even though investigating them was not part of his job. Tony Adame, a sports reporter by trade, stumbled upon Tonya McKinley's case one day while browsing Facebook. He came across a page created by Tonya's sister, Ren, dedicated to raising awareness about her sister's unsolved murder. The page shared not just the details of the tragedy, but also the emotional story behind it, explaining why the case hadn't moved forward and how it affected their family. Tonya's son had grown up, married, and had a daughter. But the page felt completely different from the usual memorial pages. While these pages often remained cold and impersonal, focused solely on the crime and the victim, Renee's page was much more human and heartfelt. It painted a vivid picture of who Tonya was, how much she was loved, and the profound impact her loss had on the people who knew her. It even connected with those who never had the chance to meet her, making her story resonate on a deeper, more personal level. It was at that moment that Tony Adame decided he would delve deeper into the case. He couldn't understand why there had been no witnesses or why no one had come forward to speak about what happened that night. Everyone knew Tonya. She was a beloved figure, and yet nobody saw anything or heard anything at the bar. It baffled him why the investigation hadn't progressed. In 2018, Tony contacted the Pensacola Police Department, requesting to see the case file. He wanted to investigate it further, to look under every stone for clues. At first, the police were hesitant. They couldn't understand why a sports reporter would be interested in a case that had gone cold for so long. However, after some persistence, they eventually agreed, giving Tony access to the file. This allowed him to publish a book in 2025 titled Pursuing the Cold Murder: Obsession on the Gulf Coast of Florida. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The following year, after Tony began his investigation, the police decided to re-examine the case, this time focusing on DNA and more specifically, genetic genealogy. In 2015, the police attempted a similar approach by uploading the killer's DNA to CODIS, but there were no matches. They then searched for relatives with similar DNA, but they couldn't find a direct connection. However, by 2020, a new trend in genetic genealogy emerged. With the development of websites like GetMatch, Ancestry, and Family Tree, there was a possibility that a distant relative of the killer had uploaded their DNA. Miraculously, a match was found with a third or fourth cousin. From there, the investigators began narrowing down their search, gradually getting closer to the suspect. In February 2020, they identified a specific name, Daniel Leonard Wells. At the time of the crime in 1984, Wells was between 22 and 23 years old, married with children and working as a carpenter in Pensacola. He was well respected in the community and had never been a suspect in any crime. However, after Tonya McKinley's death, his criminal record began to surface. According to the New Journal, 3 years after the murder, he was arrested twice, once for assault and once for soliciting a prostitute. Never done anything interesting in its first 10 years, but after the murder, Wells moved to Pensacola. While the trial was prosecuted for homosexuality, he returned to Pensacola to compare. When he did, was a direct DNA sample to compare his family. When they returned to Pensacola, while the timing of his return was suspicious, it wasn't enough to conclusively link him to the crime. What they needed was a direct DNA sample to compare. A team of investigators began following him, and during one of their surveillance operations, Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window. The police swiftly retrieved it and sent it for testing. To their astonishment, the DNA matched perfectly. With this match, the police set up an operation to arrest him. They knew his routines and the routes he took. At a specific point, they set up a routine traffic checkpoint. They stopped a few cars to avoid drawing attention. When Daniel approached, they stopped him as well, asking for his license and claiming he was speeding. As they engaged him in conversation, a second patrol car arrived, and the entire team investigating Tonya McKinley's case was ready to move in. When the police arrived to arrest Daniel Wells, they didn't immediately tell him the reason for his detention. They only informed him that he would learn the details at the police station. Daniel, visibly nervous, was sweating profusely and clearly panicking throughout the drive, a sign of his mounting anxiety. Once at the police station, they placed him in the interrogation room and asked him about Tonya McKinley. He denied knowing her, claiming her name didn't ring a bell and that he had never seen her before. However, after a few moments of pressure, Daniel broke down and confessed to the crime. According to Daniel, the events unfolded as follows. He met Tonya at the bar, they hit it off and spent time together. They went to her house, had some drinks, and engaged in consensual relations. But afterward, Tonya became aggressive. Drunk and enraged, Daniel lost his temper and struck her with a wooden cutting board. That single blow ended her life. In a state of panic, he tried to cover up the crime by using a towel from his roommate to clean up the blood. Seeing that Tonya was no longer alive, he placed her in his car and drove her to Peacock Drive, where he left her body. Daniel, according to his own confession, abandoned Tonya on Peacock Drive as if she were nothing more than a discarded object, a bag of garbage. His account, however, did not fully align with the brutal facts of the crime. Tonya had suffered a severe blow to the head, and there were signs that she had engaged in sexual activity before her death. However, the autopsy revealed something far more sinister. The sexual relations were not consensual, and the head injury was only a small part of the violence she endured. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds, indicating that Tonya fought desperately for her life. Her death was far more brutal than Daniel's narrative suggested. The police pieced together the following scenario. Tonya and Daniel had met and became friendly, and she asked him for a ride home. Instead of taking her there, he took her to his house. Tonya, a trusting woman who never suspected malice in others, didn't see the danger. They drank and spent time together, but when she decided to leave, Daniel lost his temper. What followed was a violent struggle, during which he sexually assaulted Tonya before ultimately killing her. The fight between Tonya and Daniel escalated further, with Daniel violently striking her in the head and strangling her to death. In a final act of indifference, he used a towel to wipe off the blood, loaded her body into his car, and discarded her as though she were nothing more than trash. His version of events was far from the full, horrific truth. This man was formally charged with sexual assault and murder, and the police indicated that he would most likely spend the rest of his life in prison. In response to the arrest, the Pensacola Police Department posted a statement on its Facebook page, stating that while the true reasons behind Tonya's tragic fate might never be fully understood, what truly mattered was that she was not forgotten. For 35 years, her family, friends, and the community never stopped remembering her. Now, with the criminal behind bars, Tonya could finally rest in peace. However, Daniel Wells had other plans. Just 2 weeks after his arrest in April 2020, he took his own life inside his cell, leaving the world with no answers and no redemption. Unfortunately, Daniel Wells never faced the true consequences of his actions. He never confessed to his family, asked for forgiveness, or went to trial. He did not experience the justice he deserved, and instead he took his own life in prison, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and a family still grieving. His son, Timothy Davidson, was deeply affected by the knowledge that his mother had never been able to raise him, that she never got to be part of his life, while Daniel Wells continued living his for the past 35 years, knowing what he had done. Though nothing could ever replace the loss of his mother, Timothy at least gained the truth of what had happened to her, a small comfort amidst the pain. The case leaves us wondering, was justice served? Was Daniel Wells truly held accountable for the terrible crime he committed? The answer, for many, remains unsatisfactory. What are your thoughts on the case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Or does this tragic story leave more to be desired? Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found this case both intriguing and emotional. If you did, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think justice was done? Or was there more that could have been done? I'll see you in the next video. Take care.